right. All right, so I guess we'll get started. So hold on one second. So the midterms, let's see, no, not yet. Oh, right. Okay, I wasn't sure. Okay, so the midterm is supposed to be due tonight at midnight. All right, I wasn't positive. I couldn't remember. So I noticed a lot of you have handed it in already, and that's good. Thank you. But you still have the rest of today and tonight. So just get it done as soon as you can. And then now when they get corrected is a completely different matter altogether. I've got midterms coming in from every which direction from all my schools, and so it could be a while, but they'll get done and pretty soon. And so in the meantime, why don't we get back to the chapter 7? We're almost actually done here. We just got a few more miscellaneous topics, and then we're going to switch over to something that's completely different than what we've been doing here. And that basically involves cost of production. That chapter requires a lot more calculations, but it's also very important because a lot of microeconomics is based heavily on cost and cost theory. So we will need to spend a lot of time with that topic. Now, in the meantime, we just started briefly showing how things would be very different if we had a tax on buyers rather than directly on the sellers. So, for example, if we have the tax of $1.50 is produced or imposed on the buyers, in other words, the buyers are expected to pay the tax, then what happens is the demand curve shifts to the left. All right, now before we were showing that when the tax is imposed on the seller, the demand curve, the supply curve shifts up or to the left to indicate that it is now more expensive to produce and sell this good. Actually, let me look at a more normal example here. Here we go. This is one. This is your classic example of what happens with a tax that is imposed on the seller. The supply curve shifts up and to the left because it is now more expensive to sell this product to the customers. And so what ends up happening is that at the new equilibrium point, the market price has gone up. In this example, from 15 to 15.50. Now, of that, $1.50 is being paid by the supplier to the government as a tax. So you can see what's happening here. The cost has gone up by 50 cents to the consumer, and the revenues to the seller have gone from 15 to 14. Okay, so consumers pay an extra 50 cents per pack of cigarettes. Now the sellers, even though they're collecting $15.50 instead of 15, $1.50 of that is the tax. So in other words, the amount that they're actually collecting from each cigarette pack is actually down by $1. So producers receive $1 less per pack. Oops. Yeah, they receive $1 less per pack. So both sides are worse off than they were before. But between the two of these add up to the size of the tax. So it means that in this case, consumers are paying 1/3 of the tax through a higher market price, and sellers are paying $1 of the tax because now they receive a net amount of $1 less per pack. In other words, their net revenues are now $14 per pack instead of 15 as they were before. In addition to that, the quantity of cigarettes sold is lower. And, from this buyer's perspective, that's not a good thing. Even though, of course, these are cigarettes, the buyers want them. And so they're not getting as many cigarettes as they used to get, and they're paying a higher price on top of that. So there's a tax receipt for the government, which is helpful to them, which hopefully they can spend it on something that is beneficial to everyone. But hold on one second. Let's say this yellow section is the tax revenues that the government receives, and it looks good. But the bottom line, though, is that the total surplus falls as a result of this tax. And in fact, both producer and consumer surplus go down by more than the amount of the tax revenues. So the net impact of that is that we have deadweight loss, which is this blue triangle right here. All right, so we can identify the different portions of this curve, or the graph rather. These are the tax revenues. And this is the deadweight loss. And again, the deadweight loss comes about because the consumers are paying more for less of a product that they want, and the sellers are receiving lower revenues than they were before the tax was imposed. So both producer and consumer surplus fall by more than the tax revenues that are generated to the government. And so because of that, on balance, society is worse off than they were before. And that's what we mean by deadweight loss. Okay, so in other words, a deadweight loss means that the losses exceed the gains in a case like this. Now, I did mention before that sometimes the government does this on purpose because they want to reduce the consumption of a particular product. And here, for example, they have accomplished their objective. People are smoking less. And so they may say, well, you know, it's true that we're imposing deadweight loss on society, but we've achieved the goal of reducing smoking. So the health benefits of that actually do not appear on this graph anywhere. So it can be a little bit deceiving. It depends ultimately on what they're trying to accomplish. And also it depends on what they do with those tax revenues. If they spend that money on something that's really needed, then, you know, maybe things will be not so bad. But if they waste the tax money, that could lead to even further deadweight losses. In other words, suppose they use the money to give themselves a big fat raise. Well, that may not be very helpful to society. So the losses could actually be worse than we see here, but they might not be as bad either, depending on what they do with the tax revenues and if there are indeed any health benefits to taxing cigarettes. Now, on the other hand, if the tax is imposed directly on the, oh, and by the way, don't forget, we also saw these extreme cases. This is basically a standard case, but we have some extreme possibilities as well, where, for example, if we had vertical demand curve, you can see what's happening here. The consumer is going to just pay the entire tax. So when the elasticity of demand, or I should say the price elasticity of demand, is zero, which is what it is here, the consumer pays the entire tax. All right, you can see because the entire price is reflected, the $1.50 tax is reflected in a higher market price. Now, even though the seller has to collect $1.50 of this and pay it to the government, they're still collecting $15 a pack on average, net of the tax. So the seller hasn't actually been affected by this. It's the consumer who gets stuck paying the whole thing. So the other extreme case was the flat demand curve, where the price elasticity of demand is infinity. And you can probably guess that the opposite will occur. Let's take a look at that. Yeah, this is the case where the price elasticity of demand is infinite. So here, the market price doesn't go up at all. It just shifts back from here to here. So all that happens now is that less of the good is being sold. So when the price elasticity of demand is infinite, the seller pays the entire tax. Okay, so that's because if the price goes up even by a penny in this case, the buyers of this product will stop buying it altogether. And so the sellers will lose all of their revenues. And they know that. So therefore, what they do is they say, well, listen, we'll absorb the tax because it's better than nothing. In other words, right now, the revenues at this new price, the net revenue to the seller is $13.50 times 8. And that's still not what they had before, which is $150, but still, it's a lot better than nothing, isn't it? And so therefore, what they do is they just say, listen, we'll absorb the entire cost. Now, in general, I mean, obviously, these are two extreme cases. So what that means is that as far as the price elasticity of demand is concerned, the lower is the price elasticity of demand for the good, the greater will be the percentage of a tax paid by the consumer. And of course, that implies the opposite as well. The greater is the price elasticity of demand for a good, the smaller will be the percentage of a tax paid by the consumer. So basically what we're saying here is that, who gets to pay for the, or who gets stuck paying for this tax depends to a large degree on the price elasticity of demand. But we also need to consider the price elasticity of supply as well. So ultimately, the comparison will come down to which is greater, the price elasticity of supply or of demand. All right, so let's take a look at that case. So now, if the price elasticity of supply is 0, like it is here, that means the sellers pay the entire tax. And why is that? Because the supply curve can't shift like it's just stuck there at 10 million units. So the government is basically just saying, listen, you've got to give us $1.50 out of your revenues. All right. And then if we have a horizontal supply curve, the other extreme case, well, you can probably guess the exact opposite will happen. All right. So when we show the horizontal supply curve, you'll see that the opposite will happen. Then the consumer will get stuck paying the whole thing. There it is. Okay, and you can see why, because after there's a tax, the curve shifts up and the new market price goes up by the full amount of the tax. Okay, so when the price elasticity of supply is infinite, the consumer pays the entire tax. All right, so then again, we can summarize this with a chart. Basically, the bottom line here is that, let's summarize these. And the price elasticity of supply equals 0, the seller pays the entire tax. when the price elasticity of supply is infinite, the consumer pays the entire tax. All right. So then in the real world, of course, you're never going to see, very, very rarely see these such extreme cases. So basically what we can do then is just note that in general, the bulk of the tax is paid by whoever has the lower elasticity. That's really the bottom line. We think about it as what is the elasticity of one side versus the other. So just when we combine the two, the bulk of the tax is paid by whichever side, I guess we'll call it, has the lower price elasticity. Okay, now, in other words, if the price elasticity of supply exceeds the price elasticity of demand, okay, then that means that the consumer pays most of the tax, and vice versa. Okay, so ultimately the bottom line is whoever has the highest elasticity pays the least amount of tax. Or you can think of it as whoever has the highest elasticity, the other side will pay most of the tax. All right, so this is all taken, now by the way, all of this again is based on the assumption that the tax is being imposed on the seller. Like with cigarettes, the seller is the one who actually has to send a check to the government for the tax. Okay, they're responsible for that side of it. But with some types of taxes, it's the other way around. The money comes directly out of the pocket of the consumer. And so cases like that are known as taxes on buyers. So what happens then? So imagine that no matter what the market price is, the government says you have to add another $1.50 to that. And in a way, this is like a sales tax. So instead of the supply curve shifting up and to the left, it's now the demand curve that shifts, except it's down and to the left. So either way, the way you want to think about it as a summary of this effect is that, let's just write this in here. A tax on sellers, just in general, a tax on sellers reduces the supply of the good. And that simply means the supply curve shifts to the left. And a tax on buyers reduces the demand for the good. And again, this demand curve shifts to the left. So in other words, so you don't get confused, in both cases, whoever is the tax is being imposed on, their curve is being shifted to the left. Okay, so before we kept shifting the supply curve to the left, now we're shifting the demand curve to the left. So anyway, but in this case, you can see what the net effect is. The market price goes up to $15.50, and the tax collected by the seller is $14. So this is very much like the case we had earlier. So sellers now collect a net revenue of $14 per pack, because the market price is $15.50 and they're paying $1.50 in the tax. This vertical distance is the tax. In the video we watched, they made it red, so let's keep doing that. That's my tax. And that's a loss of $1 compared to what it was before when we collected $15. And consumers now pay 50 cents higher prices for the cigarettes. So the total, again, is $1.50, but in this case, consumers pay only 1/3 of the tax. while of course producers pay 2/3. Okay, now what about the case where we have, oh, no, that was it. Okay. So in this particular case, it ended up having the same net effect. It ended up not mattering who the tax was imposed on. But there could be cases where it doesn't work this way. But right now, for this standard case, you can see that it actually ultimately does not matter who the government forces to pay the tax. Ultimately, it is split up between the seller and the buyer, depending on the relative price elasticities. So here we have the consumers paying 1/3 and the producers paying 2/3. And in general, of course, as we've seen, whoever has the highest elasticity will pay the least amount of the tax. All right, so the taxes are pretty much done. So we want to take a very brief look at two other types of situations. And one of them is called a quota, which you normally only see with international trade. A quota basically means, and let me jump ahead to those slides, a limit on how much of a product can be imported into the United States. Now, sometimes you might say, well, why would the government do this? Or alternatively, sometimes what happens is, especially with agriculture, the government, for all these decades has always traditionally been trying to help farmers when they need it. And of course, let's face it, throughout most of our history, agriculture has been a terribly risky business to be in because it's so heavily subject to weather and other unpredictable factors. And of course, farming is critically important to the economy. At this point in time, of course, farming is so insanely productive that very few people actually work in farming. And in fact, the US produces so much food that we export a large percentage of it. But in spite of that, there still exist programs that are designed to help farmers. And so one of them is in the sugar industry. There are sugarcane farmers in Hawaii who are still being protected by government policies. What they basically do is say to the farmers, listen, here's what we'll do for you. If you can all agree to put a limit on how much sugar you'll produce every year, then the market price will go up to higher levels and you'll actually have more money than you would have. But we all have to get together and agree to this. So the quota is essentially a limit on how much sugar each farmer is able to produce or is allowed to produce. They could produce a lot more, but the government, rather than sending them a check, just says, listen, instead, you all limit your quota or your output, and as a result, the market price will rise and you'll all be better off. Now, of course, who ends up paying for that is the consumer because we end up paying higher sugar prices. So that's an example of a quota, a domestic quota. But in international terms, a quota is a limit to how much of a good can be imported from a foreign country. Okay, so a quota can also refer to a limit on how much of a good may be imported from foreign countries. For example, the US government has in the past often done this, may set a limit on how many Japanese cars can be imported into the country. Okay, now what's the point of this? Why would the government interfere with the market for cars like this? And the bottom line is this. This has the effect of reducing competition to domestic auto producers. And so, which means that employment in this industry is higher than it otherwise would be. Okay, so the side effect though, well, the drawback, let's say, the drawback is that domestic consumers pay more for their cars and have fewer choices. Okay, so now, of course, you might say, well, then what's the point of this? Politically, this is very popular with politicians because you've got a small number of auto producers with a lot of political clout who can just say to Congress, you know, we would like you to protect us and we'll reelect you if you do. And consumers, on the other hand, the costs are spread out among a very large number of consumers who may not even realize that this is happening. And so politically, it's much easier to have protection for a few domestic auto producers than to allow free markets. And so it's very, there's always a very powerful incentive to have these types of laws passed. The only good thing about this, though, that helps prevent it from happening all the time is that the Japanese government might retaliate by doing the same thing to American goods. And so then you've got a trade war on your hands, and that could be a real mess. So, yes, this is happening, but it is limited by the fact that other countries can retaliate and end up damaging the US economy. So, but something like this, the auto industry has always been protected, at least since the 70s when the Japanese started to really start producing cars on a big scale. And of course, in spite of all of this, the US auto industry is just at a fraction of what it was even 20 or 30 years ago. No matter how much the government protects an industry, if it's not efficient, it's not going to be able to compete with foreign countries and it will eventually disappear. But anyway, so this is what quotas are all about. Again, there are numerical limits on production. And so the net effect will always be that there will be some dead weight loss imposed on society because of higher prices and because of less choice. So anyway, so how does this work? Suppose we have the following graph. This is a product for which the equilibrium price is $100 a ton, and normally 100 tons would be produced. Okay, so unfortunately, the government comes along and says, listen, you may not produce more than 80 tons of this product every year. So in effect, the supply curve is going from this normal supply curve. Now this becomes the supply curve. Let's see if I can put some colors on here. So in other words, you have to imagine up to this point, the supply curve has its normal shape, and then all of a sudden it's vertical because we are not allowed to produce any more of this product, no matter how high the price goes. Just like before when we saw that a vertical supply curve results when it's only possible to produce a fixed number of units of this product. So we saw one of these earlier where the supply was fixed at 100 units. So it's the same idea. The vertical portion of this curve means that from that point on, the supply cannot change. So up to this point, up to 80, we have a normal supply curve, and then it becomes vertical. So this becomes the new supply curve. And you can see the net effect of this is that previously with free trade, or sorry, with a free market, we have a price of 100 and a quantity of 100. With a quota, the price is 80. The price is 120 and the quantity is 80. So you can see there's a problem here. People are paying a higher price and they are receiving fewer units of this good. And from the seller's perspective, though, the total revenue, oh, wow, look at this. In this example, the total revenue actually went down because the total revenue went from 10,000 to 9,600. So this really didn't work out well for anyone, did it? And the dead weight loss, of course, is all of this. Yeah, they didn't do a very good job planning this one. But yes, this would be our dead weight loss. Okay, so it's always that triangle over here. This is our dead weight loss. If you sat down and calculated the new producer and consumer surplus, you would see that the difference would be the dead weight loss. And here, unlike with taxes, see now here's the other thing about quotas that makes them so harmful is that with a quota, the government does not receive any revenues. So at least with a tax, the government has some money to spend, and they can spend it on something that's useful potentially. Here, we don't even have that. That's it. There's just a limit. That's it. You can't bring in any more cars. Let's say you can't produce any more sugar, and that's that. So it's not a terribly sensible policy. But again, in political terms, it could be very popular with Congress because it can get votes from let's say the sugar farmers or the auto workers that they wouldn't have otherwise had. And of course, it comes at the expense of a very large number of consumers. So you and I, the consumer, we don't really have a whole lot of incentive to oppose this, even though it certainly is imposing costs on us. All right. Now, subsidies, one of our videos talked about subsidies. A subsidy is essentially a negative tax. All right. Subsidies are also popular with agriculture. Sometimes instead of telling farmers, for example, not to grow so much sugar, what they might do instead is say, listen, farmers, go ahead and grow all the sugar you want, and then we'll buy the surplus from you. That doesn't necessarily, it really is unfortunate. It's almost in a lot of ways as bad as a quota. You might think, oh, this is great. They can produce more sugar and consumers will have more sugar to choose from. The problem though is that what it does is that they produce way more sugar than is required by consumers, and the government has to pay for the surplus sugar, and they have to pay for that with tax money. So we're getting inefficiencies in the opposite direction. Instead of underproducing the sugar, we're overproducing it, and the surplus ends up having to be bought and stored by the government. So they will have to buy it up and store it somehow. And then, although eventually they'll sell it, there's a lot of expenses involved with subsidies. Okay, the quota, at least, the government isn't paying for any of this. They're just saying, listen, stop growing so much sugar. That's the end of it. Whereas here, this is actually taking money out of the pockets of the government. So let's see, in this case, so remember before when we had a tax, the supply curve shifted to the left. Now with a subsidy, the supply curve shifts to the right. So we end up down here, from here to here. But instead of the seller receives a subsidy of, in this case, it's looks like it's $10. Okay, so in other words, since we're on the right side of the equilibrium point, oh, hold on, I want to make that red like the video. This is now, instead of a tax, it's a subsidy. It's a negative tax in the sense that it goes into the pockets of the sellers. So when you shift the supply, look at the original supply curve, what's happening is that now, before, with the free market, you had a price of 20 and a quantity of 150. Whereas now you've got a price of 30. Well, actually, it's not, it's the price in the market is actually 10. But because the remaining 20, the $10 subsidy, oh, actually, I'm sorry, it's 20. I just realized it's a $20 subsidy. No, it's not 10, it's 20. There we go. That's much more like it. Okay, so even though the market price is $10 right here, because the subsidy is being paid for by the taxpayers, that in effect means it's as if with the subsidy, the total cost to society is $30. Sorry, with subsidy, in effect, the price rises to $30, okay, because the last $20 is coming out of the taxpayers' pockets. And you notice how they're producing 200 units when the society only wanted 150 units. So that means the remaining 50 units has to be bought up by the government, again, at the expense of the taxpayers. So the taxpayers are getting hit twice here. They're providing the subsidy, and they're also paying for the storage of these unwanted 50 units of the product. Or I shouldn't say unwanted, but these are the products that people weren't willing to pay for earlier. So the bottom line is there's a lot of expenses involved. So either way, both of these represent very inefficient interferences in the production process. Whereas with taxes, there's actually money coming into the pockets of the government, but here we don't have that. We just have deadweight losses, and at some level, either consumers have to pay a lot more money for their products, or else they end up having to pay more taxes. So either way, these are both very inefficient policies, but we still see them because they can be very politically popular. All right, well, anyway, so that takes care of that. Now we can switch over to 14, which, as it turns out, is an extremely, very different section of microeconomics, where we're looking at costs of production. All right, costs of production. So we're jumping ahead over a few chapters to get into 14. Production and costs are what we're going to be considering in this chapter. All right, now, what is this all about? Well, we want to take a step back and focus on a profit maximizing firm and what kind of expenses they encounter as they produce their goods and services. What this will enable us to do is understand better how the supply curve is derived. In other words, where is that actually coming from? Okay, so ultimately, the supply curve is determined by costs of production. So we're going to start out by noting that resource, as we've already seen, the resources used to produce goods and services are referred to as factors of production, which are land, labor, and capital. Okay, so land, labor, and capital. Land, of course, refers to natural resources, not just actual land. Labor is physical and mental activity that's used to produce goods and services. Yes, actual physical goods, I mean, not just time spent, but actual working at producing goods and services. And you notice how we break it up into physical and mental, because obviously if you're producing, let's say, apps for the iPhone, you're not doing physical labor. You're sitting there and you're using your intelligence to produce an app that people want to buy. And we also have capital, which is not financial capital, but physical equipment, buildings, machinery, etc., used to produce goods and services. Now, in economics, we often have to make a distinction between the short run and the long run. And in many cases, it involves prices. But here, what we're thinking of instead is this. In the short run, we're going to assume that these resources are all fixed except for one. And that one is typically assumed to be labor. Why is that? Well, you can probably imagine that it would be a lot quicker and easier to hire people than to go out and acquire either land or capital. Okay, labor is easy to hire. It doesn't take that long to hire new workers compared to buying land or capital. So we're going to make the following assumption. The short run is a time frame within which we cannot change the amount of labor, the amount of land and capital that we have. All right, so the short run means land and capital are fixed. Okay, labor is variable, only labor. Okay, so that's an important assumption. So in the short run, imagine yourself running a business and you've got a fixed amount of space. You've got a little store, let's say, and you've got your building and all the equipment that you're using, and you've got a certain amount of land. And so all of that would take time to change. In other words, you could, in the long run, you could buy more land if you want to expand your business. You could build a bigger building, you could buy more equipment, but that takes time and money. So let's just say that right now in the short run, that's what you're stuck with. That's it. That's all you have. Now, on the other hand, if you notice that your business is doing very well and you want to increase your output, you could now hire more workers to work in your store. That we can do in the short run. So if things are going well, we might be tempted to hire more workers. And of course, unfortunately, from the other perspective, if things aren't going so well, we can lay off workers very quickly and easily. But land and capital take time to replace or to be expanded on. So the short run is the time frame when only labor is variable. Okay, now, how long is this time frame? That depends on the industry. Okay, it's not the same for every industry. This short run period. For example, capital intensive industries like the auto industry, the short run could be several years. I mean, imagine what it would take to increase the amount of capital that you're using in the auto industry. That could be a very time consuming process. But imagine you're in a business like telemarketing. Do they even still have that anymore? I don't even know. Where they have just people sitting there calling potential customers on the phone. And you can imagine that something like this, which is entirely based really on labor when you come right down to it. I mean, sure, there have to be phones, but something like this, you could change the number of people working there very, very quickly. It wouldn't take long at all to hire more people to come in and work for you. So the short run might be a matter of literally of days, weeks, or months, whereas with the auto industry, the short run might be several years. Okay. And again, ultimately, it comes down to how you're producing your product. Are you using a lot of capital like the auto industry, or are you relying almost exclusively on labor? And in fact, it used to be like when farming was mainly done with labor rather than capital equipment, like machinery, let's say, it was the same idea. Okay, farming was done by hand. When it was done by hand, it was very labor intensive, and we could easily, quickly replace farm workers. Okay, now here we're going to look at a small microbrewery. Everyone knows what a microbrewery is, right? The word micro means small. All right. So in other words, you know that the beer industry and really the alcoholic beverage industry in general, there tends to be sort of a mixture of gigantic firms like, Anheuser-Busch, for example, working side by side or competing side by side with tiny little breweries that don't produce a whole lot of beer, but what they do make is highly specialized. And so there is a market for their product. So it's a very unique type of industry where we have gigantic firms competing with tiny firms. You wouldn't think it would be possible, but that's exactly how it works. And it comes down to what it is they're producing. Okay, the gigantic firms tend to make very standard generic beers that, like Budweiser and Miller and all the rest of those. And the tiny firms, the microbreweries, make something that's far more specialized, whose names you might not have even heard of. So there's definitely room in this market for both. So a microbrewery could have just a handful of employees. One thing about brewing is that it requires a fair amount of capital equipment, but yet it can still be done on a small scale. In fact, some restaurants actually have their own microbreweries in the building. So it does happen. So here we're going to assume that this is a small microbrewery and they have all the equipment already in place and they have all the land, the building is already taken care of. So the only thing that can change in the short run is how many workers are in this microbrewery. So let's look at this chart. And we're going to assume that on the left, we have quantity of labor. This could be the number of people who work there. And on the right-hand side, how many gallons of beer are they able to produce every day? So if you notice, L represents quantity of labor. And we can define that in a lot of ways. Like I said, it could be the number of people who work there. It could be the number of hours that people work. It could be defined in a few different ways. Let's just say that this represents the number of people who work there. TP is actually shorthand for total product. Okay, it means how many gallons are we producing every day. Now you can see when there's nobody working there, then no beer gets produced. No matter how many machines you have to have people working in there. They have to do something. And even if all they do is turn on the machines, somebody has to be there to run this business. So we need at least one worker before we can turn out any beer. Now, what's interesting, if you notice it very carefully, when we add one more worker, our output goes from 0 to 3. All right, now this person has to do everything themselves. Imagine, even no matter how tiny this business is, you've got one person who has to do everything. They have to answer the phones. They have to, collect money from the customers. They have to actually make the beer. They have to do everything. It's kind of like, imagine a McDonald's that has one employee. That employee has to not only cook the hamburgers, but he or she has to also take the orders. So you can imagine that's going to be pretty frantic for that one employee. When we get a second employee in, though, now all of a sudden they can each start to specialize in a few tasks and do it themselves. In other words, it would be like in a McDonald's again, where instead of one person, you have two. One does all the cooking and one just stands in the front and takes all the orders and collects the money. You can imagine that's going to vastly improve their productivity. From 1 to 2 makes a huge difference because we can have now specialization can take place. And by which I mean each person can specialize in one or a small number of tasks rather than trying to do everything themselves. And so because of that, even though we only doubled our labor, look what happened to our output. It almost tripled. So this is the beginning of where we see specialization taking place. Now, if we add a third person, we can specialize even further. All right. And so you can see that's reflected in the output, which goes up by 4 now. So the increase in output is not quite what it was up here. Here we had a gain of 5 beers or 5 gallons. Here the gain is only 4. But it's still a big gain, okay? So here I added a third worker and my output jumped up by 4 units. Up here though, it only went up by 3. So we went from a gain of 3 with the first worker to 5 with the second worker and 4 with the third worker. Now we hire a fourth person and the output jumps up by 2. Now you notice a pattern developing here. As I keep adding more workers, the extra output that they bring me is going up more and more slowly. Why is this happening? Well, that's a good question. It's true that we have specialization over here, but here's what's holding this up. Hold on, let me just open up a separate document here. So why is this happening? Why is output increasing more slowly as we add more workers? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, there is only so much equipment to work with in the building. Okay, with more workers, they may have to wait for each other to finish using the equipment to use it themselves. And people are standing around waiting. So it's like, again, imagine a McDonald's where there's only one fryer. No matter how many people are working there, only one person can make fries at a time. And so therefore, we're going to see a lot of waste. People standing there waiting to get to the fryer so that they can also make fries. So the lack of equipment is going to suddenly become a problem because you've got more and more people working there and they're trying to use the same equipment. In addition, there's only so much room in the building, and the workers can start to get in each other's way, as you can imagine. Which reduces output or productivity. So no matter how productive the workers are, let's face it, they've only got so much equipment there. And so this becomes more and more of a problem as we keep trying to fill in the building with more and more workers. So remember, we assumed that we're in the short run, which means we only have so much so much land and so much capital. So this becomes more and more of a problem as we add more workers. And you can see that because of this, if we add a fifth worker, our output doesn't go up at all. Okay, because it's suddenly becoming so crowded in this building that the workers are simply getting in the way of each other getting their work done. And if we have a sixth worker come in, we actually reduce our output by 2 units. So that's pretty frightening to think about. We actually hired another person, and through no fault of his or her own, the output actually went down. So the pattern that you're seeing here is pretty typical for the short run in any business because only the labor is variable. Now, if we could go out and get more, buy a bigger building or something like that, well, then none of this would be a problem. As soon as we start getting more workers, we just expand the size of the business, fine. But in the short run, we can't do that. We're stuck with what we have. And so even if we keep trying to add more workers, it won't do us a whole lot of good once we get past the fourth worker. Okay, after that, you're just wasting your time and money by hiring more people. So once we get to this point, the only option we have is to get more capital or land. So if you look at the numbers and we put these together into a graph, you'll see a very interesting pattern emerge. What is that pattern? Okay, so here's what we're looking at. So on the vertical axis, we have total product or total gallons of beer per day. This is called the total product, or sometimes it's called the total product of labor because only labor is variable. Down here, we have L, the number of units of labor that we hired per day. Now, if you look at it carefully, now it's hard to tell with this Excel graph, but at first, the slope of this curve is actually fairly flat, and then it starts to get steeper and steeper up to a point, and then it starts to rise, and then suddenly it starts to flatten out again, and eventually we reach a limit. So in other words, at first, let me just go back and show you, output is increasing at an increasing rate up to the second worker, and after that, it starts to increase at a decreasing rate. Okay, so, and again, it's really hard to see with this curve. let me see if I can draw a little better on this Word document. This is very difficult to do in Excel. Here we go. I'm going to try to show you exactly what's going on here. And again, it's going to be difficult to do this by hand as well, but I will give it a shot. So what we're trying to show here is that at first the output rises very quickly, and then it hits some kind of a peak. And then it starts to slow down. So let's say that this here, this is 2. With 2 workers, the output was, let's get these in here, 8. Okay, 8. With 1, it was only 3. And then with 3, let's say it went up to, where do you go, from 3 to 8 to 12. That's what it was. Okay, so 12, let's say it's right about here. Okay, then at 4, it went up to 14. And then at 5, oh, okay, so see, I didn't draw this well at all, because at 5, it stayed at 14. So I didn't do this a very good job here, did I? How can I fix this? I'll tell you what, let's do this. Yeah, the curve itself has to be fixed. You know what, I'll tell you what I'll do. How about if instead of drawing the curve in advance, I will draw the points and then I'll fill in the curve. That might be a better strategy. So 14 turns out to be the maximum. And that occurs when we have both 4 and 5 workers. And then at 6, we actually end up with 12. All right, that should be a little bit better. All right, that's not so awful. I mean, it could be better. This curve, by the way, is called the total product curve. And this TP is in terms of gallons per day. So basically the idea here is that the slope is rising. Positive and rising. Let's call it, okay. Let's rename that. Slope is positive and rising. That takes place everywhere up to 2. The slope is positive and rising. And then here, no, I actually, so again, it isn't really, it's not the slope so much. I'll tell you what, let me just describe this a little bit differently. What's really happening is that the slope I think a better way to describe it is that the slope is increasing at an increasing rate. How about that? I think that sounds better. And then we'll move up here and we'll see that in the next region from 2 up to 4, the slope is actually increasing at a decreasing rate. It's still positive, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. And then across here between 4 and 5, the slope is 0. And then, of course, down here, as you can clearly see, the slope is negative. And that means that adding more workers after the 5th worker will actually reduce your output. So between 4 and 5, we get no change in output. So where do you actually want to produce? Well, that ultimately depends on how much the beer is selling for compared to the cost of the labor. But it should be pretty clear that there's no point in hiring the 5th worker unless they're willing to work for free. And then certainly you don't want the 6th worker, even if they're working for free, because your output is going down. Anyway, so this is an important idea. The shape of this curve reflects an extremely important result in economics. In fact, if you were to make up a list of, let's say, the top 10 concepts in economics, what's about to come up next would be definitely a candidate for that list. What we're seeing here is called, this is an illustration of what's called the law of, let's make this a little bigger, diminishing returns. Okay, the law of diminishing returns is what we're seeing here. This is something that whenever we're in the short run, the output of a good at first increases at an increasing rate, then it increases at a decreasing rate, and before reaching a maximum value, and then decreasing. This is always the case in the short run when only one variable or one input is variable. So it's called the law of diminishing returns. I'll note here in parentheses, sometimes it is called the law of diminishing marginal returns. We'll see why in a few minutes. Now, you have all experienced this firsthand. I'm sure when I tell you this analogy, you'll understand right away. Imagine the following situation. All right, so suppose that you realize that you need 10 hours to properly study for a test. Which would be more efficient? Study 1 hour per day for 10 consecutive days. Study for 10 hours on the day before the exam. All right, so what do you think? In fact, I'll tell you what, let's have a poll. We haven't had a poll in a while. So let's try this. Which is more efficient? Number 1, study for 1 hour per day for 10 days. 2, study for 10 hours on the day before the exam. All right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a poll. And of course, this is based on your personal experience, but I think I know what the answer is going to be. Okay. So far we have, obviously we have a big lead for 1 hour a day for 10 days. We do have one person who likes cramming. Okay. Well, anyway, now the big question here, now of course, to a certain degree, this depends on the individual, but what would you say is the reason why studying for 10 hours a day before may not be the best idea in the world? Okay, why is this happening? Well, among other things, and you know this from experience, um, most likely, oh, here we go. Why? You get tired and then you don't learn as well. That's exactly right. It can be overwhelming. Whereas if you're doing an hour a day, you're at your peak productivity for that 1 hour, and then you go on and do something else. Okay, so for 1 hour, you're really focused, and then the next day, you're focused again and again. And also, while you're doing it over 10 days, what happens is your brain has time to absorb everything you've just learned. Whereas with studying the day before, the problem is as each hour goes by, you start to become tired. And even if you're not physically tired, you get tired of the material. And in fact, psychologists have proven that if you try to study for too many hours, you can actually it can actually become counterproductive. In other words, you can actually make yourself worse off by overstudying. Now, yes, it's true. And for certain things, yeah, you might be able to make the case that if you're doing something that's so complicated that it doesn't make sense to just do an hour at a time. Some things that might be true, but I would say that realistically, um, most likely, studying 10 hours at a time is less productive because you're starting to experience, because after a few hours, you become tired and it becomes more difficult to absorb the material. So you are experiencing the law of diminishing returns. Okay, in other words, um, let's say the last 3 hours are not nearly as productive as the first 3 hours. I think you'll all agree with that one. Even if you do cram, when studying 1 hour at a time, each session can be equally productive. So the total amount of learning should be greater as a result. All right. So it's just the reality is that as you keep trying to study, you do get tired. You get your brain gets saturated. You even start to resist learning more because your brain says, "Listen, that's it. I can't handle it anymore." And so, studying 1 hour at a time, and like I said, each time you study, your productivity is very high. Whereas this way, your productivity definitely goes downhill as the day wears on. So, people, you may have been successful cramming, but most likely you would have been better off if you had just done it a little at a time. And that's again because, that's the way the brain works. Now, here, this is different because we're looking at physical productivity, but you run into the same problem where the more people you try to add, the less and less extra value you're getting from each one. Now, this implies, now here's the situation here, because firms will experience the law of diminishing returns. This means that producing more output incurs increasing costs per unit of output. This is why firms will not produce more of a product unless the price at which they can sell the good increases. Okay, in other words, in this example, the microbrewery can increase its output from, let's say they suddenly realize that they've got enough demand to sell 14 gallons instead of 12, from 12 gallons to 14 gallons. But the cost of producing the last 2 gallons will be relatively high, so that in order to do this, they must charge a higher price. In other words, every extra output, every extra gallon that they produce is going to end up costing them progressively more. And so because of that, they're willing to do this, but they have to get a higher price in the market when they sell this beer. So this is why, or this is one of the reasons why the supply curve is upward sloping. Okay. The bottom line is, at least in the short run, cost of production will increase as output is increased. That's really kind of the bottom line. It takes more and more. We have to pay, in a sense, more and more for each gallon. In fact, if we had numbers, we could actually do that, where you could see how much each laborer costs and how much we can sell the beer for. We could show that the cost per gallon is actually going up. And in fact, later on in this chapter, we'll do something just like that, where we're going to show that as we try to make more and more of a product, the actual cost of making it is going up and up and up. And therefore, we have to expect a higher price in order to produce more of our product. All right, well, you know what? I think we're right at the end here. So we've got a lot more of this to go. Here we basically just introduced the topic. There's a lot more to follow in this area. So remember, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to understand productivity and also the cost of producing the product that we're making. And this will give us a whole set of new graphs that we can use to analyze the output of different types of businesses and help us figure out what would be the profit maximizing output for these firms as they try to determine what price and quantity to sell. All right, so don't forget about the midterms if you haven't already finished it. They should be ready by midnight tonight. And then in the meantime, we'll just cut it off here. And next week, we'll just pick it up right here where we left off with chapter 14. Okay? So unless there's any last minute questions, I will see you then.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
All right. See you later.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.